Are you an adult who worries you may have ADHD? Or are you just interested in the 6 main signs of adult ADHD? In either case, you're in the right place. In this video, I'm going to take you through the first steps. There's a screening test with 6 questions that'll tell you whether you may have adult ADHD, and then I'm going to take you through my answers to these questions to give you an example of how someone with ADHD might answer these questions. Now, the process may not be the same in your country, but most doctors use very similar criteria to decide whether they need to assess you for ADHD. The version I use is an NHS test that was put together with the World Health Organization, and this is entirely designed to be used this way. It's a self-reporting test, which means that you answer the questions for yourself based on your own experiences, and your doctor uses the answers to these questions to decide whether they want to assess you for ADHD. I talked in a previous video about my reasons for seeking a diagnosis, but I feel that a lot of people have very similar reasons to me. A trusted friend said that she suspected I may have ADHD. While she didn't tell me I did, she said that she suspected I should probably get it looked at. Now, I found that there are other signs that also made me think that I may have ADHD, and you may also find that you have these other signs, but that's probably the topic for another video. In the end, all I can say is that I had a suspicion, so I decided to get it checked out. So my first step was to take a screening test. Looking at my score on this screening test, I saw that I should be looking for proper assessment. So what I did, I took this to my doctor. Before I start, I just need to say I am not a doctor. I can't give you a diagnosis. These questions can't give you a diagnosis. This is a screening test. All the test is meant to tell you is whether you should ask for further help. Now, for each of these questions, you're going to want to give it an answer of either never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. If you write down the answer to this next to each of these question numbers, numbered 1 to 6, at the end, I'll go through them and tell you how to give yourself a score. I want you to understand that the answer to these questions may affect you in your social life, in your personal life, in your work or school life, or even in your romantic life. So question 1 is, how often do you have trouble wrapping up the final details of a project once the challenging parts have been completed? I'll just give you a moment to write down your answer to that question. Remember, the answer could be never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Pause the video if you need to, just to give yourself time to think about that. Question 2. How often do you have difficulty getting things in order when you have to do a task that requires organization? Again, I'll give you a moment. The answers could be never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. Question 3. How often do you have trouble remembering obligations or appointments? Question 4. When you have a task that requires a lot of thought, how often do you avoid or delay getting started on that task? Question 5. How often do you fidget or squirm with your hands and feet when you have to sit down for a long period of time? And question 6. How often do you feel overexcited or compelled to do things as though you're being run by a motor inside your body? Now, if you need to, go back, rewatch that section of the video, try and answer the questions for yourself. Pause it as often as you need until you have those 6 answers. Are you ready? For each time you answered sometimes, often, or very often for the first 3 questions, give yourself 1 point. For the last 3 questions, only give yourself 1 point if you answered often or very often. For these 3, sometimes doesn't count. The full version of this test does have 18 questions, but the first 6 are used to decide whether you need to be assessed for ADHD, and the last 12 are used to help assess what type of ADHD you may have. Now, there is only really one type of ADHD, but the symptoms are separated into more hyperactive symptoms and more distracted symptoms, where most of us will have some combination of the two, but will be primarily at one end of the spectrum, primarily at the other end of the spectrum, or dead center suffering from all of them at once. So at this point, you should have a score from 1 to 6. If you scored 4, 5, or 6, there's a good chance that you may have ADHD and you need to talk to your doctor. Now, I can't stress this enough. You need to talk to a doctor. This test doesn't tell you whether you do have ADHD. It just tells you whether you should be assessed for ADHD. Now, at this point, you might not be 100% sure whether you've got the answers right. So what I'll do is I'll take you through what my answers were to each of these questions and see whether that helps you at all. So question 1 asked, how often do I have trouble wrapping up a project once I've done the challenging parts? It's interesting because it says challenging, not easy. I actually enjoy challenge. So in my case, I do very well at the challenging parts. It's when you get to the easy bits the boring bits, the repetitive bits, that's where people like me struggle. So I did struggle. Now I said often rather than very often here, because I do struggle. So question 2 asked me, how often do I have trouble getting things in order if I've got something that requires organization? And in my case, again, I said often. Now the reason I said often is because while I don't have a problem writing down a list of tasks, what I can suffer from is an inability to put them in the right order. So I might want to do the more interesting ones first. Quite often I was told as a game developer that I wasn't very good at prioritizing. So what I'd do is I'd try and do a task and then suddenly discover that I hadn't done the task that needed to be done first. So in fact, it was impossible for me to finish what I'd started. So I'd be jumping from one thing to another and back again. Question 3 asked, how often do I have problems remembering obligations and appointments? And that happens quite often for me. I do set alarms, and I'm very lucky to have a wife who can tell me when I've got things coming up. I have friends who will try and remind me of things. I have my wife to remind me of things. I have Alexa. I have Google Assistant. All these things together can help me function, but in and of myself, I do struggle a lot with appointments. I also have a problem where I may be late to an appointment simply because I didn't think about the fact I needed to drive there. I was so caught up in something I was doing first, I turn up late to my appointment. Question 4 was asking, how often do I put off the beginning of a task if I think it's going to take a lot of thought? The answer here is, again, often. I do often have a problem. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm going to sit down and play computer games. This doesn't mean I'm going to sit down and terrify myself with how difficult it's going to be. Sometimes it's just a little voice in the back of my head that says, yes, this is important, but have you vacuumed the living room? Have you put the washing on? Have you folded all the laundry? So one thing that some people with ADHD will find is that on those days when they have a very important but slightly difficult task that requires a lot of thought, a lot of housework gets done that day. Question 5 asked, how often do I fidget with my hands and feet or squirm if I have to sit down for too long? The simple answer is that it depends how long is too long. In my case, maybe I can manage half an hour, but 3/4 of an hour, especially in a boring meeting, I'm going to start fidgeting. So if you find that you can sit for half an hour, but maybe you start to lose the ability to sit still after that, if there is a limit to how long you can sit still before you fidget, I don't mean because you're a little sore in your seat, I mean that drive to move, then maybe you should be ticking often as well. Now the final question asks, how often am I overly active or compelled to do things? And the answer here, I think, is rarely. I might say never, but the truth is that sometimes I do actually feel the need just to move, just to do things. So you don't need to have all of these symptoms. This isn't something that I would have scored high enough on the test for me to get a point for, but it's still something that's there in the background. So I took these 6 statements about how often do these things happen, and I put them into the online form for my doctor. The doctor called me back later that day, put me on a waiting list. Now that waiting list was supposed to be 10 months. It actually turned out to be more like 3. I was seen by a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist sent me a number of questionnaires to fill in. He even sent one for my wife to fill in so they could get an idea of how other people see me. And after that, I was given an appointment where I had a meeting with the psychiatrist. We talked over my symptoms, we talked over my answers to the questionnaires, and then he gave me a formal diagnosis of ADHD, primarily distracted or inattentive type. Later that day, I made my first video, and that's how this channel started. Thank you so much for watching this video to the end. If you want to help me grow, I'd love it if you'd like, share, and subscribe. If you have any feedback for me, please leave a comment. Well, that's all I have for this time, but I do hope you'll come back and join me on my journey as I try and learn more about being an adult with ADHD. Thank you. Bye.